Good morning, everybody. Hope that you are doing well this morning. I have gotten sick and tired of trying to do this while sitting down. And so this morning I've decided to try raising everything on my desk up enough, and we'll see if I can do it standing up after having been doing everything sitting down for a while, and also to see if I can keep myself from moving too much, as I don't have to tell you, I am a wanderer when it comes to teaching. And so I'm going to try to kind of keep it relatively still so I don't give anybody motion sickness watching everything on their computer or on their phone. This morning we're going to be continuing our study in the book of Kings, and we're going to be looking at the first of two classes that we're going to have on the king of Judah. That is specifically, we're going to be talking about Hezekiah. Now, Hezekiah is, as we're going to see right off the bat, one of the greatest kings of Judah. In fact, one of the two best kings, the two kings that get unreserved praise by our inspired author or editor. And he is one of the two kings who removes the high places, which is something that we've kind of not seen up to this point. And we're going to get started into him this morning. So one of the first things that we see when we get started there in the book of Kings is that he is, from the very beginning, different from what we've seen before. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that when we consider what's going on here in the book of Kings and move over to read what we're going to start out with here in the first 8 verses of 2 Kings chapter 18, that immediately, although he's going to be compared at the beginning of his reign to the king of Samaria, he's not only different from any of the kings we've seen of Samaria, he is different from any of the kings that we've seen so far in the book of Kings at all. So I'm going to go ahead and read that for you now. In the 3rd year of King Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. He removed the high places, and he broke the pillars, and he cut down the Asherah, and he broke into pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days the people of Israel had made offerings to it, and it was called Nehushtan. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses. And the Lord was with him. Whenever he went out to battle, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. He struck down the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory, from watchtower to fortified city. So we see here in this already so far in what we're seeing here in this king, that he is totally different from what we've seen before, right? That he is first and foremost contrasted with Hoshea, who's the last king of northern Israel. And even though he's the son of Ahaz, who's the worst king that we know of from the south, he is not at all like him. He's 25 years old when he begins to reign. He's going to reign for 29 years, from about, say, 715 BC to about 687 BC. There's a little bit of difficulty in figuring out exactly when his beginning date is. We're really sure that by 701 BC, we're going to have Shalmaneser come in and attack. But before then, sorry, not Shalmaneser, that we're going to have Sennacherib come in and attack. But exactly if there's a problem with the 714 date, or if it's actually a little earlier, doesn't matter so much. The reason why it does matter a little bit is because this is a really important time in Assyria's history. We've seen that one of the main interlocutors, I guess, or foreign powers that has dictated everything going on in foreign policy for the last few kings has been Assyria. Now, Tiglath-Pileser III, who we've seen called Tiglath-Pileser earlier, and also Pul, he died in 727 Okay? And his son, Shalmaneser, had been powerful. He's going to be the person who comes in and destroys the northern kingdom, which we have referenced in just a minute, and what we've seen last time in 2 Kings chapter 17. But his son Sargon II had been a very powerful ruler for a while. But even though he was a powerful ruler, he was busy fighting other battles. In other words, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II's grandfather, and Shalmaneser V, Sargon II's father, both of them had campaigned militarily in Syria, Palestine, the land of Israel, a lot. But Sargon II, starting there in 722, he doesn't do that. He has bigger fish to fry. Down a little bit farther south is the kingdom of Babylon, who we know is going to become very powerful soon. He has its own new king, and they've started rebelling against Assyria. A guy whose name is, in the Bible, Merodach Baladan, or in Assyrian records, Marduk Apla Idadina. But he starts rebelling, and a lot of Sargon's attention is focused on him. Furthermore, there are these people called the Urartu up farther north who have also been rebelling. And so Sargon has been fighting a long time trying to keep the lid on all of this, and he has not been able to turn his attention to go and look over at Syria, Palestine. Now this is going to cause a problem because Judah and all the other peoples around Judah, from the Edomites and the Philistines and the Syrians and everybody else, they think that maybe Assyria is getting weaker. And maybe they're going to have a chance to rebel. And in fact, when Sargon II dies in battle and his son Sennacherib comes to the throne in 705, they think this is our chance. Egypt in the south has a new king starting to become powerful, and they think they might be able to help. You've got Tyre and other people who decide to withhold tribute from Assyria, and that is going to be the setting for what we see is going to happen here when it says that he's going to rebel against Assyria. But that's not the only thing that he does. More important for, in some ways, the biblical story is the summary of what's going on here with Hezekiah. And that is, after an extremely long list of Judahites who don't do this, after a long list of northern kings from Samaria who don't do this, reading that here we have Hezekiah, a king who does what is right in the Lord's eyes, is an amazing change. We have not seen a king like this ever, who receives unqualified praise, not since the destruction or the division of the kingdom. And in fact, we're only going to see it one more king when we get to Josiah. But here we've gone through all these kings, and all of them have some sort of a description, like he does what is right in the Lord's eyes, but not like his father David, like we've seen for Joash or Asa or others. Now that doesn't mean that Hezekiah has no problems. That doesn't mean that Hezekiah doesn't make some pretty big mistakes. He does. But he does what is right in the eyes of the Lord, like David. He doesn't worship idols. In fact, what he also does is it's not just that he is like David in terms of destroying idols. He doesn't worship at the high places. In fact, he removes the altars other peoples have set up. He cuts down the Asherah, who we've seen before. A lot of people thought was a kind of a cultic item, or even perhaps a goddess that they put alongside of the Lord. He destroys the high places. He even destroys another cultic item, the one that God had actually commanded back in Numbers chapter 21 to build, the bronze serpent. It turns out the people had even taken this good thing that God had made and turned it into an idol and were sacrificing to it. And Hezekiah destroys it as well. In summary, the way that it says it is that Hezekiah trusted in the Lord. And this phrase, like no one before him or after him, that is a descriptive phrase that just means incredibly well. That he's, we would say this is, you're the best. It's not, meant to be a specific qualifier, but rather you're amazing. And that's what he does. And he doesn't do what they've done. He doesn't do what the northern kingdom has done. The northern kingdom, we have a kind of a revisal here, or a reminder. They're destroyed because they didn't trust in the Lord, because they didn't remove the high places. And a king here that does the opposite, it's pretty incredible. Now, 2 Chronicles chapter 29 includes a whole lot more information about what Hezekiah does. He begins to cleanse the temple in the very first month of the very first year of his reign. He restores the temple musicians. He makes more gold and dedicates it to the temple, covers the doors with gold leaf and things of that nature. He invites even the Samaritans up in the north who had been kind of worshiping God and then also worshiping the other gods to come and join them. In 2 Chronicles chapter 30, we read that these people had been impure, they were not cleansed, and he invites them to take the Passover, and he actually inquires from God, and God lets them wait and take the Passover a month later. That Hezekiah is this great reformer. Now, Kings doesn't include that information for two reasons. Probably. The first is that Kings wants to focus on this interaction between Assyria and Babylon. Hezekiah is the first king who's going to interact with kings from both empires, and so that's going to be a really important narrative element that the inspired writer wants to do. The second thing is that he wants to focus on Josiah as the great temple reformer, because it's closer to the end of Judah's reign. But I don't want to spoil that until we get there before. But regardless, we see here that Hezekiah's strength is not based on physical things. It is based on trust in the Lord. And the Lord is with him because he does what he is supposed to do. That God is with the king of this tiny, insignificant regional power. That Israel, even though Israel is far more powerful than Judah, that they're destroyed because they don't worship God the way that God wants to. But here he defeats the Philistines, he rebels against Assyria, he breaks with his father's policy of idolatry and also his foreign policy as well. And then as we have this king set up, we're going to find it's not all sunshine and roses, but it's still a stark contrast in exceeding number of ways, and it's going to make everything more obvious as we move forward to see why. But this phrase about the rebellion that we have here, right? The focus on the rebellion that we have then for Hezekiah and what he does, it's going to be described in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 18. And I'm going to go ahead and read that here for us. In the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. And at the end of 3 years he took it. In the 6th year of Hezekiah, which was the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel, Samaria was taken. The king of Assyria carried the Israelites away to Assyria and put them in Halah and in the harbor, the river of Gozan, in the cities of the Medes, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord, their God, but transgressed his covenant, even all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. They neither listened nor obeyed. I'm going to scroll down here. And in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong, withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. And the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. And at that time Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorposts that Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria sent the Tartan, the Rabsaris, the Rabshakeh, with a great army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. And they went up and they came to Jerusalem. And when they arrived, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is on the highway to the washer's field. And when they called to the king, there came out to them Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna, the secretary, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder. So we have here the description then and then the discussion of what was going on before. In other words, we read in the summary of Hezekiah that he rebels against Assyria. Well, for the rest of chapter 18 and 19, it's going to talk about that rebellion. It is going to be one of two events that shapes Hezekiah's life and legacy. But it starts out by giving us sort of a review of what had happened before. And that is what had happened before this occurs is that Shalmaneser, an Assyrian monarch, came and besieged Samaria. And this happens during the reign of Hezekiah. It says the 4th year of Hezekiah, the 7th year of Hoshea. And Shalmaneser besieges Assyria for 3 years, and he destroys it. And this is key, and it's going to be even more important when we get to the end of what we're going to read about today. He carries them out of the land, across the river Jordan, and into a foreign nation. And we read why. It's because they didn't obey the voice of the Lord. They didn't do what Moses had commanded. That it is exactly opposite of what we've seen Judah do just above. That Judah is doing right. Judah is destroying the high places. That Judah is doing all these different things. That in other words, is not just about physical preparation. It's not just about military power. It's about doing what God says for the reasons that God has said to do them. But it also sets up the rebellion of Hezekiah. Because these two events are put in parallel. What I mean by that is, in each case, we have an Assyrian king, first Shalmaneser, and then Sennacherib, come and besiege the capital city of the nation. Shalmaneser had come and invaded and besieged Samaria, a powerfully set city that lasts for 3 years, and he takes it. And here Sennacherib has come to invade Judah and has come against Jerusalem in the 14th year of Hezekiah. This is 701 BC. It's 10 years later. And we read and we wonder what's going to happen. Because it says right at the very beginning that Sennacherib takes all of the fortified cities of Judah. This is part of a broader campaign. I'm going to show you a picture after this slide that he has come and invaded all the way down the seaboard from the Mediterranean. He takes Tyre, he takes Sidon, he destroys a lot of the Syrian cities. He's going to invade Philistia and Edom and Moab and Hamath and Byblos and Arvad and Ashdod and all these other little city-states. And the last one on his list there is going to be Judah, and it's going to be Jerusalem. And we think, oh no, what is going to happen here? You know, what's going to play out? What is he going to do? And it says exactly what he tries to do. He sees that everything has been taken except for Jerusalem, and although Jerusalem is a powerfully fortified city, it was not the top jewel in the crown of the Judahites here. That's actually Lachish, which is a larger part of this discussion. I can discuss it a little bit more, I think, next class. It'll fit a little bit better in there, but we'll see a little bit in the map this morning. And he panics. He says, oh no, I'm going to end up just like the king of Samaria, besieged and destroyed. He sues for peace while the army is still at Lachish, which is his major power. Perhaps it's fallen, perhaps it's about to fall. It's hard to figure out and reconstruct the exact nature of events. He pays an enormous tribute, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And did you catch where he received this money from? Did you notice where he got it from? That where he gets the money, I guess we could say, to pay off this debt is by looting the temple. All of that investment that he'd made, all of the things that he'd done in putting gold throughout the temple and silver and vessels and everything else, here, now he has to take it away to pay for this rebellion. But even though he pays him off, we're going to see that Sennacherib doesn't accept the loss. Instead, he sends this guy called the Tartan, the Rabsaris, the Rabshakeh. These probably are not names. Instead, it's more likely that these are titles. Rabshakeh means something like chief butler, but just like we discussed, in the time of Joseph, when we went through some of those sermons, this is not a position that we would think of like a chief cook. It's just a position in the household that became meaningful for something else, a chief position. We might call him, a military commander or a top general or something like that. But when we read this, what we're supposed to wonder about, what we're supposed to expect is another Assyrian victory. And we should expect another Assyrian victory. Assyria is vastly more powerful than Judah. But there's one thing, well, a few things I guess we should say, that Judah has that Samaria doesn't. And we're going to see that all of those are going to be part of the reason for why Judah survives when Assyria does not. So when we get, I mentioned that I was going to explain a little bit here what's going on with the description of the invasion. Let me give you a little bit larger picture of the map so we can see what's going on here, and put on my trusty laser pointer. So we read that God is with Hezekiah there in the first 8 verses of what's going on in our book of Kings, and we can see this a little bit in the map. That we read in Chronicles that Hezekiah makes a lot of descriptions, a lot of decisions in Jerusalem here. He builds this thing called the Broad Wall, which is discussed a lot in Isaiah, which I think David is going to be brave enough and kind enough to teach us, maybe when he's done with John. He builds a tunnel. I'll show you a picture of that to get water. He sends out to all these different cities that you can see. He builds them up as well. And he sends them supplies in these special jars. He expands and takes over a lot of the lands of the Philistines, including Ashdod and Ashkelon and Joppa. He pushes farther south and takes some land over here. In other words, he expands Judah's power significantly. He is one of the most powerful kings in Judah's history. It's that is sort of aided, I guess we should say, by the Assyrians having destroyed their main rivals there in Samaria beforehand. But it's also because he's doing what God says, and God has promised to bless the people when they do what he has asked them to do. But in spite of that, and we'll discuss a little bit why this is at the end of class, in spite of that, God also is going to bring Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, down into Judah. Here's a map of that, and I can explain a little bit because the book of Kings doesn't go into it too much. There's more information in some of the other prophets. First of all, he comes down from the north, from above where we can see in this map. He takes Syria, he takes, like I said, the western seaboard there of the Mediterranean, or the eastern, I guess, if we think from our perspective. He takes Syria and Tyre and all those cities, and then he breaks his force into 2 groups. The first group he sends over here to take out the king of Ashkelon and to destroy and take care of a lot of the problems over here in the Philistines. And that group is going to kind of bebop its way, destroying towns and major cities. For example, we know that he destroys Azekah because he writes a letter back home. It's called Letter to the God of Ashur there. Or the prophet Micah talks a lot about him destroying Gath and other cities like that. And then he comes down, and his main victory is going to be at this city called Lachish. So David has shown you pictures of this before where he's dug. It's an enormous city. It's a massive site. There was a huge wall. It's kind of the main military site of what's going on there in Judah at the time. But the other force has come down here and is focusing on the different side of the valley, taking all these little smaller cities. Anatoth, of course, is where Jeremiah's family's from. Or we have Nob here described in Isaiah. Isaiah is going to be the prophet we'll see here as well. And also in Jerusalem. And here with Rabshakeh being sent to Jerusalem, that is where our story then is going to pick back up in what we're doing then here today. So the Rabshakeh here coming to Jerusalem is going to be the main point of what's going on there. Make sure that, yep, that's set up right. And that's what we're going to get into, is reading what's going on here in verses 19 through 37. So I'm going to go ahead and read there 2 Kings verses 19 through 37. And the Rabshakeh said to him, "Say to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, on what do you rest this trust of yours? Do you think that mere words are strategy and power for war? In whom do you now trust that you have rebelled against me? Behold, you are trusting now in Egypt, that broken reed of a staff which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all who trust in him. But if you say to me, no, we trust in the Lord our God, isn't it he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? Come now, make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses, if you're able on your part to find 2,000 riders for them. How then can you repulse a single captain among the least of my master's servants when you trust in Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? Moreover, it is without the Lord that I have come up against this place to destroy it. The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it." I'm going to scroll down now. Then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and Shebna and Joah said to Rabshakeh, "Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Don't speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall." But the Rabshakeh said to him, "Has my master sent me to speak these words to your master and to you, and not to the men sitting on the wall, who are doomed with you to eat their own dung and drink their own urine?" Then the Rabshakeh stood and called out in a loud voice in the language of Judah, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand. Do not let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord by saying, the Lord will surely deliver us, and the city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me, and come out to me, and then each one of you will eat of his own vine, and each one of his own fig tree, and each one of you will drink the waters out of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land just like your land, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey, that you may live and not die. And do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you by saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamat and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Ivah? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who among the gods of all of those lands has delivered their lands out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand?" But the people were silent and answered him not a word, for the king's command was, do not answer him. Then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna, the secretary, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and told him the words of Rabshakeh. So here we have then this situation where the Rabshakeh, the general here, who gets one of the longest speeches in the entire book of Kings, and reminds us in some ways of Satan in the garden in Genesis 3, in some ways of Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17 when he's arguing with David. He's bringing some really good questions, some really important questions, and in some ways functioning as a prophet to the people of Jerusalem. He says, in whom or in what do you place your trust? In whom or in what do you place your trust? Now, this is a good question, because he offers some alternatives. He says, Are you placing your trust in Egypt? Now this is a problem, right? Because do you remember what we said was the straw that broke the camel's back up in Samaria's destruction? It's when Assyria found that not only were they planning on rebelling, but they'd sent messengers to Egypt. And that we've seen that one of the biggest problems in the book of Kings is when people trust in Egypt, when they do the exact opposite of what God has said. He's told them repeatedly, don't go back down to Egypt. Don't multiply silver and gold. Don't marry many wives. Don't go back down to Egypt to build up horsemen and chariots. But from the beginning of the book of Kings, with Solomon chapter 3, up until where we just ended with the destruction of the northern kingdom in 2 Kings chapter 17, the thing that ruins Israel more than anything else is trusting in Egypt. And although we have to read between the lines a little bit, that is something that Hezekiah has been doing. Hezekiah has trusted in Egypt. It's one of the reasons he decided to rebel when he did. Egypt is going to be the beginning and ending of Israel, and it is representative of the total rejection of God's saving power. And as you read through Isaiah a little bit more closely, and as you read through the narratives and Chronicles, and read a little closer what's going on here in Kings, then what we realize is that what Rob Shaka says when he says, God sent me to destroy all these cities, is that's true. God had sent him to test and to show that Hezekiah had been trusting in Egypt and had not been trusting in the Lord. Because that's the other alternative. Instead of trusting in Egypt, you can trust in the Lord. That's who they should be trusting in. That's who they, on the whole, we're going to see are trusting in and ultimately show in their trusting in. But here, because he's still an idolater, although he may be sent by God, it's not like he understands or really trusts in God or anything like that. He says, why would God serve you if you've torn down his idols? When we know, in fact, that is exactly why God is going to serve them. Because he's torn down their idols. And he gives them a wager, and he says, let me put this in some terms that you can understand. I'll give you 2,000 horsemen. 2,000 horses, an extremely, extremely rich gift. If you can find 2,000 trained soldiers to ride them. And it also then connects back down to Egypt, that he says you've been trusting in Egypt for horsemen and for riders, and that this is going to be the reason for their judgment. Well, we see that what happens is that these officials of Hezekiah's kingdom, Eliakim and Shebna and Joah, they're like, no, please, you're scaring people. Don't talk in Hebrew. Talk in Aramaic. We speak Aramaic. The rest of the people on the wall don't speak Aramaic. We don't want to start a rebellion. We don't want to start a riot. We don't want to start a problem. In fact, there's a lot of reasons to believe that what the whole purpose of Rob Shaka here, the whole reason he's come is he wants to depose Hezekiah. He does just because Hezekiah has given him tribute, and this picture that you can see on the PowerPoint is actually a picture of the king here, Sennacherib, receiving tribute from the Judahite city that we've seen, Lachish. Is he doesn't trust him still to serve him anymore. He says, you rebelled against me. I'm going to replace you with a different king. In other words, it seems like he's trying to start a rebellion, and they're wanting to beg him to speak in Aramaic instead. He says, no, I'm not going to speak in Aramaic. I want to start a panic. These are the people who are going to be, reduced to eating their own dung and drinking their own urine during a siege. And perhaps maybe his words were even a little stronger than that. In other words, he says, don't listen to Hezekiah. Don't listen to Hezekiah. You can't trust him. That's not who you need. He's going to deceive you. He can't save you. And that's true. But where he goes wrong is he says the Lord can't save you. And he holds up as the alternative. He holds up as just as powerful. He holds up as a foil to the Lord. He says, trust in the king of Assyria, and she will protect you. Come and trust in me, and each one of you will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and no one will make you afraid. Well, that should remind us of a few different things. First of all, that is, of course, a passage from the prophet Micah who also is talking about the Syrian instruction. But even more importantly, it is something that we read is reminiscent of the best in Judah's history, that under the time of Solomon, every Israelite had his own vine and his own fig tree, and that he was not afraid. And he says, you want to get back to peace? Come trust in me. I will take you to a good land. I will provide to you what the Lord is not, and you will not die. Now, when you hear, and you will not die, that should be ringing in our ears, right? Because that, of course, is exactly what Satan says to Adam and Eve. And there are, if you look closely enough, a few other kind of connections, very, very light connections, that shows that this is in some ways a retelling of the garden as well. Are they going to trust and stay where God wants? Or are they going to rebel and do what is right in their own eyes? And he says, look, the other gods of other nations haven't saved them, including Samaria, who, according to his view, kind of worships the same God. So why then would anybody else? In other words, don't listen to Hezekiah. Well, the people hear this, and they're worried. They tear their clothes in mourning. They act like one who is dead. I'd mentioned that one of the things that Hezekiah does when he's trying to prepare for the Assyrian invasion is he builds this tunnel to bring water. This is the tunnel of Hezekiah. Like I said, maybe next class I'll show you a pretty cool picture of David and Lisa and me and Catherine and some other folks you may know, like Nathan and Brooke Ward. David and Lisa didn't walk through that, but the rest of us did. It's really neat if you're not, claustrophobic or don't want to get wet, I guess. But here we're going to see then is what is going to happen. What's going to occur? What is Hezekiah going to do with this news? Because what we've seen in the past, when we considered what's going on in the rest of the book of Kings, what do we expect? Well, we've had before kings be in trouble to foreign kingdoms. And God sends a prophet to them, whether that's Elijah or Elisha or somebody else. And what happens? The kings don't listen to the prophet, right? But the exact opposite is actually going to happen here. What we're going to see is going to occur is rather than God having to send a prophet to the king, this is a king who trusts in God, and this is a king who trusts in God's prophets, and this is a king who, rather than waiting for a prophet to be sent to him that he's going to have to ignore, he instead sends to a prophet. And that's what we're going to read there in the first 13 verses of 2 Kings chapter 19, which I'll read for us now. As soon as Hezekiah heard it, he tore his robes, and he covered himself with sackcloth, and he went into the house of the Lord, and he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the secretary, and the senior priest, and all these people, right? And he says, thus says Hezekiah, this is a day of distress, of rebuke, of disgrace. Children have come up to the point of birth. There's no strength to bring them forth. It may be the Lord God has heard the words of Rabshakeh, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to mock the living God, and will rebuke the words that the Lord your God has heard. Therefore lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left. When the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words you've heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria has reviled me. Behold, I will put my spirit in him, so that he will hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword on his own land. Then Rabshakeh returned, and he found the king of Assyria fighting against Libnah, because he heard the king had left Lachish. And the king heard concerning Tirhakah, the king of Cush, behold, he has set out to fight against you. So he sent messengers again to Hezekiah, saying, thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, the king of Judah, do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, you have heard that the king of Assyria has done to all the lands, devoting them to destruction, and you should be delivered? Have the gods of the nations delivered them, the nations that my fathers destroyed, of Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden, who were in Telassar? Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king of the city of Sepharvaim, and the king of Hena, or the king of Ivah? So here we have then the same sort of a situation that we've seen before, that we have Isaiah the prophet who comes in, the king hears the word, he tears his clothes, and he sends off to the temple. And Eliakim and these other officials, they go in sackcloth and in the ashes, and they appeal to Isaiah. They say, don't you realize what's happening? It's a day of terrible stress, and the Lord has been reviled. And Isaiah says, yeah, God's heard, don't worry. He knows that he has picked a fight with me, and I'm going to take care of him. So you don't be afraid. Well, that may seem okay for us. Rabshakeh does leave for a little bit to go kind of rendezvous with the king of Assyria, who's moved on from Lachish after it's been destroyed and gone on to Libnah. And he does hear, and kind of at first there's a kind of a seeming thing about Egypt that maybe this guy Tirhakah, the king of Cush, there are some historical issues here that we're not going to get into. Just know there are a few little issues with kind of understanding what's going on there. And he says again, though, don't trust in Egypt. Don't listen to what's going on there. And that is, again, good reason to do that. And what he tells them to do then is he says, you need to bow down to me. I have destroyed all of these other peoples. And Hezekiah now finally really gets it right. And what I mean by that is Hezekiah goes to the temple. And he brings the letter that Rabshakeh had written where it said, don't trust in the Lord. And he brings it to the Lord. He brings the letter that says none of the other gods of other the nations had saved them. And he brings it to the temple. And we shouldn't read past this, because the book of Kings has shown us numerous kings coming to the temple, including Hezekiah. And when they come to the temple, it's for one reason. They come to the temple to take stuff from the temple. They come like Joash, they come like Ahaz, they come like even Hezekiah, to strip the temple of its gold and its silver, to treat it like a bank that they can rob to pay off foreign nations. Whether that means to pay off foreign nations to get them on their side, like had started the Judah and Assyria relationship to go and fight against Samaria, or whether it is to pay them off like Hezekiah did, where he strips the very gold that he'd put into the temple to pay off the other nations. That is not how they were supposed to come to the temple. In the book of Kings, the reason they're supposed to come to the temple, the reason that Solomon prays in the dedication of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 7 through 9, and what God responds, and he says, if you are ever under attack by foreign nations, and you come to the temple, and you pray in the temple, and you remember the promises I've made you, then I will save you. And that's what Hezekiah does. Something that he doesn't do before now, and which none of the other kings up to this point have done. And he comes to the temple, he says, you are the God of, you alone are God. He says, the gods of the other nations that people trust, they're not really gods, not gods like you are. You are alone. You are above them. You are above the cherubim. You are at the tippy top, and there's no one else there with you. You alone are the creator God who has created heaven and earth. So incline your ears to us. Listen to our prayers and listen to their mockery. Show everyone that you are not an idol. Show everyone that you are in control. And then everybody will know that you are not a god like what they think about. And then God sends Isaiah. He sends Isaiah and he says, God has heard the mocking of your voices. God has heard what Assyria has said against me. God has heard everything. That she despises and she scorns you, the virgin daughter of Zion. She wags her head at you, the daughter of Jerusalem. And God says to Rabshakeh, whom have you mocked and reviled? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes to the heights? That you've done this against the Holy One of Israel. By your messengers you have mocked the Lord, and you've said, with my chariots I have gone up to the height of mountains, to the far recesses of Lebanon. I felled its tallest cedars. I felled its choicest cypresses. I entered its farthest lodging place, the most fruitful forest. I dug wells, I drank foreign waters, and I dried up with the full sole of my foot all the streams of Egypt. In other words, Assyria thinks they're the ones in control. Assyria thinks I'm powerful, and so I've destroyed all these nations from Egypt in the south to Lebanon in the north. And God says, no, you didn't. He says, I did this. 2 Kings 19, verse 25. Haven't you heard that I determined it long ago? I planned from days of old what now I bring to pass, that you should turn these fortified cities into heaps of ruins. In other words, God says, I'm the one who's orchestrated this entire affair. I brought you down to judge my people. I have made use of you to show that Hezekiah has been prideful. And what we have play out after this as Hezekiah is strengthened is that God says, I'm going to give you proof. I'm going to show you in a sign. I'm going to put a hook in the nose of the Assyrian and bring him back out the way he thought he was going to bring you out. He says, I'm going to bless you so much that you can eat this year and next year without even having to plant. That the remnant will be protected. And he says, as proof of this, Jerusalem will be besieged, but it will not be destroyed. Jerusalem will be besieged, but it will not be destroyed. He says in verse 29 through 31, and this will be a sign for you, that this year you eat what grows of itself, and in the second year what springs of the same. And then in the third year sow and reap and plant vineyards and eat their fruit. And the surviving remnant of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upwards. For out of Jerusalem shall come a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. For the zeal of the Lord will do this. And then he has a condemnation. Then he has I guess we would call it a curse. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come up into this city, or shoot an arrow there, or come before it with a shield, or cast up a siege mound around it. By the way that he came is the way he shall return, and he shall not come into this city, declares the Lord. For I will defend the city, and I will save it, for my own sake, for the sake of my servant. And that very night, the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when the people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went home and lived at Nineveh. And as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch, his god, Adremelech and Sherazar, his sons, struck him down with the sword and escaped into the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his place. So we have here set up in this situation a promise that Judah, although Judah cities have been destroyed, that Jerusalem will not be. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about this next time. But this is indeed what happens, that from the Assyrian records themselves, they go in and they destroy all sorts of cities of Judah, tons and tons of walled cities, but they don't take Jerusalem. And they return home with just the tribute that they have. And there's some questions in the Assyrian records about exactly why. Again, we'll address that a little bit more next time. But what I want to leave you with is this. And that is, there's an interesting thing that happens here at the very end. And that is, it brings back this Exodus imagery that we've been seeing emphasized so far. And that is that we've had this sort of pseudo-Exodus description of what's going on here. Do you notice what happens? That it's a reverse Exodus. That before this happens, Hezekiah is the first king in a very, very long time to take the Passover. We read about that in 2 Chronicles chapter 30. And just like God had sent an angel to destroy the firstborn of Egypt, that would let them come out of the land and leave, that here the exact sort of opposite happens. That God sends an angel and he destroys 185,000 of the Assyrians that send the oppressor running instead of Israel able to leave. In other words, where Assyria wants to come and take Israel out of the land and verses in the Exodus where Israel wants to leave the land of Egypt. Here it remains them free in the land of Israel rather than taking into slavery in Assyria. And whereas what leads Pharaoh to finally letting the people go is the death of the firstborn, including his own firstborn, here what happens, even though we know from Assyrian records 20 years later, that the Bible has telescoped these events together in order to make this point, that God has had his own sons kill him for coming against God's people. In other words, the way we might want to put it together again is that this is a reverse exodus, that what God has done is he has made sure his people can remain in the land because he has remembered the promise that he made to Moses. And he does that through his king, David. And those two roles, Moses and David, is exactly, of course, what we've been focusing on in our study in the book of Kings. There's no king like David and no prophet like Moses. And ultimately, what we're going to need and what Kings recognizes deeply that is needed is a new king, a new prophet that will be even greater than Moses and greater than David. And those of us who know recognize, of course, that we have seen what they only longed for. We have seen what they longed to look for, that we have seen Jesus, priest and prophet and king, who too will defeat all of enemies and defeat death and bring us into the promised land. Well, I hope that your day has gone well. We're going to continue next week to study more from Hezekiah's life. We'll talk a little bit about the historical stuff and also continue into the next two chapters, verses 20 through 21, and go through and see what's happening there in the rest of his life, is particularly with what occurs not with Assyria, but with Babylon. Hope you have a great day.